we're going to talk about laying out our exterior walls. The walls around the perimeter of our basement, just inside the insulation. We're going to lay out all of the perimeter walls first, get everything nice and square, talk about what we need to do to space the walls away from things that are protrusions, away from the walls like plumbing, fixtures, utilities, things like that. So we're going to deal with these kinds of things in this video. In subsequent videos we'll talk about laying out interior walls, talk about framing around other obstacles in the basement. We'll go from there. We're going to frame the walls on top of the floating subfloor. Again, it's going to keep the wood studs up off of the floor, away from any concrete, so we don't have to worry about using any kind of pressure treated wood or anything like that, because the wood itself for the framing is now protected. First, I wanted to take some measurements and figure out how I had to space my walls away from any of the things that are sticking out from the wall, like the piping or plumbing or other stuff. And the walls, as I said in an earlier video, they're not straight. They're poured concrete, so there's a little bit of a bow and a wave to the walls, just a slight amount. So you have to be careful about finding where your smallest clearance or tightest clearance is going to be for your wall up against the things that are sticking out. The way I did this, what I found was easiest is first I would actually kind of use an eyeball test, and I just kind of line up along the wall and take a look, and you can almost by visuals try to see, you know, what is the shape of the wall or the contour of the wall, and start to look for where maybe the tightest places are going to be. So then from the places that I thought were the tightest, I took a level, worked off of that spot, found my level, and then made a mark on the floor. I did that in all the spots that I thought were tight, and then I took measurements at various equal distance spaces along the wall just to make sure. At that point, I could run a chalk line from the spot that I found was the furthest away from the wall, and as you can see, I've snapped the chalk line all the way along. I did the similar process on the second wall, and from there, first found out not only how much clearance I had to make, but the walls also to some extent are not necessarily square. When the foundation is poured, they can be a little obtuse or acute. And I'm exaggerating here, but they can be not necessarily 90 degrees apart. So I took a little extra time also using some construction squares to make sure that not only did I have the proper spacing, but I could set the wall at the proper 90-degree angle from each other. Mark that with my square over here on the floor, and then again snap the chalk line running the other way. In building this wall over here, notice that I have this drain line for a sewage coming around the corner here, and I've got this corner coupling. This corner coupling is sticking well out from the corner of the wall. If I would have built the wall right up into the corner where I drew my chalk line, then this stud would have been interfering with this corner pipe, and I would have had to cut it, notch it, or do something else. It just so happened that if I spaced this bottom plate one plate width away from the chalk line, that gives me perfect clearance around this corner. What I'm going to do now is when I lay my next wall and I put my bottom plate the same one stud width away from that corner, and I build my next stud up this wall here, first it's going to give me my two studs that I need to attach my drywall. It's also going to give me all the clearance I need back here in this corner. What I've also done is I've nailed just a couple additional pieces of framing back here, so that once I build my next wall and I've got my second stud for my wall here, it just gives me a place that I can nail into and connect the two walls together as well. So now that we've had all our measurements done to our studs, we've cut them, I've laid them all out here on the floor. I found it real easy to do it and lay it out right in front of where I'm going to work. Then using my framing nailer, I'm going to nail the studs to the top plate and the bottom plate, and then afterwards we'll stand up our wall and get it in place. Okay, now that I've got my wall in place, the first thing that I want to do is get it lined up on my chalk line. And the way I've done it here, some people put the chalk line in the front. It depends on what your preference is. I put my chalk line in the back. Just was easier to take my measurements off the wall. I'm going to screw that to the floor. Again, we're building our walls on top of the floating subfloor, and I don't want to penetrate through the vapor barriers and really not penetrate through the insulation. So I'm using 2.5 inch deck screws. So here's an after shot of what the wall looks like that I framed after I've cut and trimmed out around the window. And after we framed our soffit around this end, where we've had to frame the main wall underneath this duct trunk. So drop it down from the top plate up along the joists, drop down that wall here, run underneath the duct trunk, tie it into the next section of wall, and then also ultimately frame around that to build the soffit. We'll address things like how I dealt with building the soffits, trimming out various things, and framing around obstacles in subsequent videos. One thing I've been asked about is when I build a wall that has this kind of a gap or cavity between the foam on the wall and then our stud wall, and again primarily here it's because I'm trying to work around plumbing or other obtrusions that are sticking out from the wall, so we need to build our wall away to be able to clear that kind of stuff. So then we've got this gap, and I've been asked if I'm not using any kind of solid fasteners or things between the foam and the concrete. Again, I'm not using solid fasteners. I don't want to compromise the vapor barrier. I also don't want to have thermal bridges and so on. What I have done is I've used some blocks of the foam between the studs in a few places and the foam wall. Used a little bit of foam adhesive here, and then to make sure that it's going to stay in place, you can see I've used a shim, always going in the vertical orientation, so that if over time the adhesive ever does kind of break or come loose, or there's any kind of thermal expansion this way in some way that causes it to be a little loose, and this did start to, let's say, fall, then this shim is going to get wider as we go towards the bottom, so this is always going to have some kind of positive pressure in the downward thing. So if this ever did start to fall, it's working its way down the thick part of the shim, or the widening part of the shim. But again, this foam adhesive that we have, I've got a bead going all the way around this block and also around here. I don't expect this to go anywhere. That's just going to provide a little extra positive reinforcement between our stud, through this block, and against here to make sure it always stays up and against the concrete wall. You can see I've got those spaced every maybe 2 or 3 studs along the wall. So here's an after shot of what the wall looks like that I framed after I've cut and trimmed out around the window. And after we framed our soffit around this end, where we've had to frame the main wall underneath this duct trunk. So drop it down from the top plate up along the joists, drop down that wall here, run underneath the duct trunk, tie it into the next section of wall, and then also ultimately frame around that to build the soffit. We'll address things like how I dealt with building the soffits, trimming out various things, and framing around obstacles in subsequent videos. In subsequent videos, we'll talk about laying out our interior walls. Once we get our exterior walls all square and plumb, then it's going to be real easy to get all of our interior walls square off of that. So we'll talk about laying out our interior walls in another video. We'll talk about dealing with things like how to find the right stud heights in a basement, because you got varying heights that you have to deal with around the basement. And we'll also talk about other framing challenges that we run into relative to overhead structures, obstacles and obstructions and things you're going to run into a basement you wouldn't have in new construction.